hearing about that. The ongoing assault on Gaza reveals once again the mainstream media's failure to expose the scale of Israel's atrocities against Palestinians and its unwillingness to hold those in power to account.
The destruction is one to blame. Hamas.
So you condemn the Hamas October the 7th atrocities.
Would you get rid of Hamas?
There is no way you can sit there and not condemn the actions of Hamas.
It's shameful for our colleagues to reduce the framing of any interview with Palestinians to a matter of whether or not they condemn Hamas.
The mainstream media is completely complicit, particularly in the West, in covering up the crimes that Israel is committing, but also, allowing our politicians to repeat lies.
But can independent journalists and political activists break the cycle of disinformation and selective reporting? Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to Bigger Than Five. Today, we explore the role of the media in crafting narratives that influence public opinion and often serve to justify or condemn the actions of governments engaged in warfare. From the war in Ukraine to the genocide in Gaza, institutional media's role in shaping public perception through complicity or failure has exposed its blatant bias and double standards. 20 years ago, senior American and British reporters and editors failed to question the Bush and Blair government's deceptive justifications for the Iraq invasion, becoming de facto accomplices in a war based on lies and false pretenses. When WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange published evidence of their war crimes, which the mainstream media had ignored, he was punished and jailed for years. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Jeremy Scahill, an American independent journalist whose investigative work has highlighted the media's role in promoting government narratives for wars, and Fiona Lali, a British activist who has taken on the political and media establishments here in the UK. But first, a look at how the so-called free press has aligned itself with powerful interest groups to manufacture consent around Israel's war on Gaza.
Nearly every war that has started in the past 50 years has been a result of media lies.
It is not voluntary relocation.
Shame on you for that.
Let us please, let us,
shameful anti-Semitic equation.
let us.
Our media gives Israelis names, Palestinians are statistics.
Sanjita, that's an outrageous framing of the reality.
It's not an outrageous framing.
A siege is appropriate, cutting off power, cutting off water.
Well, I think that Israel does have that right.
So, is the mainstream media peddling misinformation to suit certain political agendas? Joining me now to discuss this is Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of the recently launched Drop Site News. Jeremy, how would you describe what we're seeing in the mainstream coverage of Gaza and Ukraine when it comes to the juxtaposed difference in both language and focus?
I mean, the fact that you have these simultaneous wars, one of which is being backed and facilitated by the United States in Gaza, and then you have the war in Ukraine, which is being waged by Vladimir Putin and Russia, has really dramatized that facts don't actually matter to the narrative of the United States and its allies. The circumstances on the ground, the actions of those committing mass violence, those are irrelevant. What matters most is who's the official bad guy and who's the official good guy. In the case of Israel, you have a scorched earth genocide that has been waged with the full political, military, financial, and legal support of the United States and other Western nations. And Israel is promoted as the defender of democracy in the Middle East. And on the other end, you have the NATO alliance facilitating the Ukrainian side with weapons, political, and legal support against Vladimir Putin and Russia. And the predetermined narrative is that Putin is the second iteration of Hitler. When the Israelis bomb hospitals, the United States runs to its defense and looks for ways to justify it. When the Russians hit a hospital in Ukraine, it's immediately denounced as a war crime worthy of prosecution at the International Criminal Court.
Why this discrepancy? Why this selective outrage?
The tragic reality is that most major news organizations that are serving as conveyor belts for the propaganda of the United States, or in this case, Israel, they don't have to be told what to write. They've been well trained, and it just comes as second nature. In order for Palestinians to be recognized as victims of Israeli aggression, there has to be more than an overwhelming presentation of facts to prove that they were in fact civilians, or this was in fact a hospital that was hit. In the case of the narrative about official enemies of the United States, be it China or Russia, evidence doesn't much matter. What matters is this embrace of an oversimplified narrative that someone is the second coming of Hitler. We saw that with Saddam Hussein. We're seeing that right now with the war in Ukraine. The fact that NATO has been pushing eastward, the fact that the United States has been facilitating human rights abusing units within the Ukrainian military, or that the Russian population in the eastern part of Ukraine was under a state of siege. This context, while it doesn't in any way excuse the actions of the Russian government, is at best a footnote and often is not even mentioned in the news coverage.
One of the most troubling aspects of the institutional bias in the Western mainstream media is how almost every TV presenter on every network often begins their interview of a pro-Palestinian guest with the same question: do you condemn Hamas? What does it tell us about the state of journalism?
I entirely reject that question. I think it indicates either a total lack of understanding of the 76 years of history that preceded the events of October 7th, or it's an intentional effort to try to distract from the fact that the people of Palestine were subjected to a 7 to 8 decade long campaign of annihilation and extermination. The fact of the matter is that trying to reduce questions about what is happening right now in Gaza to October 7th is a way of trying to erase the political context in which the Palestinians exist. Now, we can have a discussion about the tactics that were used on October 7th, and I certainly have no support whatsoever for the kidnapping of elderly people or children, or the shooting of unarmed civilians. But to imply that this happened in a vacuum and that everything was fine in Gaza on October 6th is to engage in a lie of historic proportions. I reject this, and I would say it's shameful for our colleagues to reduce the framing of any interview with Palestinians to a matter of whether or not they condemn Hamas. Do those reporters recognize that this is part of a 76-year history of genocide and expulsion by force backed by the United States and probably by the governments of those very presenters you're referring to?
How culpable does it make them? The fact that they essentially are giving the Israeli side a free pass.
Look, late last year, there was a key moment in the scorched earth Israeli attack against Gaza, and that is when the Israeli military started to lay siege to Al-Shifa Hospital, the most important medical facility in Gaza. The Israelis claimed that there was like a Hamas pentagon underneath Al-Shifa, and they produced a fabricated three-dimensional video showing this kind of evil lair that they said that Hamas had underneath it. And of course, now we understand that was a total lie. But the United States didn't just co-sign the lie at the time. The United States said it had its own independent intelligence that it did not acquire from the Israelis, that in fact Hamas was using an underground facility at the hospital as a command and control center. Now that was a total lie. The United States never produced any intelligence to back it up. But what it did is it gave the Israelis the green light and the legitimacy of the stamp of approval of the United States government, which controls the veto power at the Security Council and is the dominator of the world militarily, to go forward. And as a result, 36 Palestinian hospitals in Gaza have been decimated as a starvation campaign has set in, as unprecedented levels of injuries, particularly to children and women, have unfolded in Gaza at the hands of the Israelis. It was the United States that opened the door for that and said, yes, this is a legitimate thing for the Israelis to do. You can even attack hospitals.
And of course, when journalists dare to counter these claims or question some of these assertions, they're very quickly labeled as anti-Semitic, which is in many cases enough to silence, intimidate almost every person.
That in a public way is quite insidious, of course, to imply that someone's anti-Semitic because they're opposing the Israeli propaganda narrative, or even if they're opposing what clearly is a genocidal campaign in Gaza. But I talked to whistleblowers within the New York Times newsroom, for example. There is a witch hunt that's gone on at the New York Times to try to figure out who was leaking to me and my colleagues. We did a series of reports showing that the New York Times had issued edicts for its reporters to steer clear of certain terms like genocide or refugee camps, or to refer to Palestine without framing it as a matter of discussion at the United Nations. It was very, very clear from the beginning of this war in the aftermath of October 7th that the New York Times and other major news outlets were intent on ensuring that the Israeli narrative was not going to be subjected to the same level of scrutiny as any other narrative in this war, and that Palestinians were going to be treated in a different way.
Are we seeing the extent, the scale of the devastation today without any accountability, largely because the media has failed to do its job, refused to do its job, as Julian Assange famously said many years ago, that if the media had done its job, we wouldn't have had all the wars we've had over the last 50 years.
Yes, and it's even more lethal than that description. More than 130, by some estimates, 160 of our colleagues, journalists, Palestinian journalists, have been killed in Gaza. And some of them have been intentionally targeted and murdered by the Israeli government. Israel and its backers don't want the world to understand the scope of the genocide in Gaza. And part of why they're killing these journalists is because they want to kill the truth. They want to kill the story.
But can it do so
I want to
today?
stand here today and condemn any journalist in the world who has remained silent in the face of an unprecedented killing spree meted out against our colleagues on the ground in Gaza. Those journalists deserve the defense, the protection, and the solidarity of every single news worker on this planet, and it has been shameful to watch their silence.
How much of this misleading narrative that we see, Jeremy, when it comes to war and the media has to do with the institutional racism beyond the fact that there are also obviously political considerations and financial calculations?
I would say it's the politics of empire. I mean, at the end of the day, the United States is an empire. The British government knows a lot about empire, and I think that the way the perspective that is pushed on the public in the United States and Britain is that the dominant narrative of the state must always be given deference, and the narrative of any other people, particularly those that the powerful nations are at war with, they must be fact-checked relentlessly. And even then, we may not even state the truth about them because it's inconvenient to the narrative of empire. This is so deeply embedded into the mindset of corporate journalism that you don't even need orders anymore given by powerful nations to their news outlets. They just do it.
The idea that US wars and now Israel's war in Gaza is a morally justifiable war, that these are humane wars, that their morally superior armies do all they can to avoid civilian casualties. I mean, isn't this a recipe for more wars that go unchecked?
I mean, the first rule of waging war as an empire is to dehumanize the people that you want eliminated. But the flip side of this is that the world is waking up. You have governments recognizing an independent Palestinian state. You have the international courts that are now reviewing Israel for its genocidal conduct in Gaza. Palestine is, I think, in many ways, a Rubicon that is being crossed, and the world has fundamentally shifted. Where it goes from here is in the hands of ordinary people who have the audacity to say no in a time of the empire trying to shove yes down all of our throats.
Jeremy Scahill, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So how does the picture compare with what we're seeing here in the UK? A recent report published by the Centre for Media Monitoring found that over the last several months, pro-Israeli sources were quoted more often and challenged less frequently than Palestinian sources. The report exposed significant biases in media coverage. Among its key findings, emotive language to describe Israelis as victims of attacks is used 11 times more than to describe Palestinians. TV channels overwhelmingly promote Israel's, quote, right to defend itself, overshadowing Palestinian rights by a ratio of 5 to 1. Israeli perspectives are referenced 3 times more than Palestinian ones. 75% of online articles frame the situation in Gaza as an Israel-Hamas war, with less than 25% mention of Palestine or Palestinian. With me to discuss this is Fiona Lali. She was a candidate in the recent UK general election. She is the National Campaigns Coordinator for the Revolutionary Communist Party. Fiona recently took on the former British Home Secretary.
I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to any war criminal. I want to grow this encampment. I want to grow a movement.
Well, it's quite strong stuff. I mean, as far
criminal.
Fiona, you've not shied away from taking on politicians and telling them to their face that you believe they're liars and war criminals, warmongers, because of their staunch support, both military and political, for Israel's war on Gaza. Why is it so important for you to challenge politicians in this way?
I think it's important for these politicians to realize just how much anger there is in society towards them because of their support for Israel. But not just that, these politicians are getting away with murder. And that applies to what they do in Britain as well. I mean, people like Suella Braverman, who is an ex-Home Secretary, she's someone who we don't often get access to. These politicians like to act in the way that they do and think they're doing it in the name of democracy or in the name of what's right in the international stage as well. And it's so far removed from the truth of the matter and also what people think of them.
How complicit, in your view, is mainstream media for giving them this open platform to make the statements that they do unchallenged?
The mainstream media is completely complicit, particularly in the West, in covering up the crimes that Israel is committing, but also, allowing our politicians to repeat lies, repeat fabricated stories in order to continue justifying the Western government's support for Israel. I think one of the clearest examples of this was way back in October, every single mainstream newspaper ran stories about beheaded babies and many other atrocities, things that have been proven to be completely false. I think more children have died in 4 months in Gaza than in 4 years of armed conflicts all around the world. That was a report from the UN. It is indescribable, the atrocities that are taking place, and yet there's a conspiracy of silence in Western media about this.
What has been missing in the narrative?
I would say at root, the truth, which is that this isn't just about October, this isn't just about the last 9 months, this is about something that has been in place for 76 years, a whole system, a whole occupation that has displaced, that has killed Palestinians for many, many years. And also just a complete dehumanization of an entire people. Everything that the media does in the way it reports on what is taking place is consciously done in a way to try and take out the actions of Israel. And we have to say, why do they do this? It's because they want to justify and protect Israel's role, protect the occupation, because Western governments and Western imperialism has an interest in maintaining that occupation, has an interest in maintaining Israel's position. And I think once we understand that, that's very important. It is racist and it's wrong, but the racism has a purpose. I think it's important for us to see it in that way.
When words like butchered, massacred are used in the context of October 7th to describe Israeli victims, but are never used to describe Palestinian victims. They're found dead. They die, we do not know at the hands of whom, we do not even know how. How much trust do you still have in the media?
I have no trust in the mainstream media, really. Faith and trust in the media is at a complete record low. And I think the problem is, look, if they are willing to do so much to cover up these horrific crimes that are taking place in a country far away, right, from people who live in Britain, the next question is obviously, if they will cover up those crimes far away, what will they cover up here at home for things that might seem closer to us? And I think it's really a dangerous moment, perhaps, then, for mainstream media.
If the media had been asking the right questions, the important questions, would we still see countries like the UK, the British government, supply arms in the way they do to Israel?
If there was more honesty in the media, it would perhaps quicken the ability of people to see the truth of what is happening and stand up against it. But I would say, despite the fact the media has tried very hard to protect Israel and protect Israel's role, polls show in Britain that actually a majority of people do want us to stop sending weapons to Israel. So, you know, the role of the media has been atrocious, but what I have confidence in is the fact that despite that, people are beginning to see through it.
And are they seeing through it because of the rise of social media? How much has it transformed the landscape? How much has it changed the narrative?
I think social media plays a massive role. I think most people, young people especially, get a lot of their news from social media. And so they can see the truth every single day of the videos, the pictures, the horrible stories of what is coming out of Gaza. That has played a massive role. And I think it's also a reflection of the general discontent and lack of trust in society. The same people who are justifying these atrocities in Gaza are the same people trying to justify austerity here.
If many people, certainly the younger generation of people here in the UK and in other countries, look to social media for their news, for an unfiltered, raw, true depiction of what's going on in the world without any allegiance to any political opinions or any financial restraints that some of the major networks or newspapers certainly have. There is also, isn't there, a downside to social media, and that is it's also being suppressed to a large extent. A lot of the views that are anti-war, pro-Palestinian, you might say, are being suppressed in many cases, and a lot of accounts are very quick to label such views as anti-Semitic. Yes. What are your views on this?
The problem that this exposes is ownership, right? Part of the reason why the mainstream media has been so biased in its reports of what's happening is because of who owns that media. And then the same is true for social media, right? There is someone at the end of the day who owns these companies who is then able to censor the voices that they think are wrong. So there is a limit to social media. So I think we should see all of this as an auxiliary to the rest of the organization and work that we need to do.
This brings up the issue of the glaring double standards that we see in the media's coverage of what is going on in Ukraine and what is going on in Gaza, doesn't it? When Russia is accused of bombing a children's hospital in Kiev, the media's headlines are very quick to accuse Russia by name. The institutional media erupts in outrage. It's called a war crime. When Israel strikes, we often hear the media barely whisper the word complicated. A schoolyard full of children playing football is bombed. The media virtually turns the other way. Is this just part of the reality of the world we live in?
Yeah, I mean, it reflects the fact that the media is very connected to the general interest. Mainstream media is connected to the general interests that a government or a ruling class has in a particular country. And I think the comparison with the war in Ukraine is so important because, as you say, ever since the war in Ukraine began, there have been constant reports, constant investigations trying to expose all of the horrific atrocities that Russia has committed, right? And there are atrocities, there's no doubt about that. But the fact that they've gone so far to do that is because they want to justify continuing their support for that war.
At the heart of it, what does it boil down to? Is it about redressing the injustices, the lies, the inaccuracies, about holding government accountable? How do you see the role of the media? How fundamental is it to what you are fighting for?
I think this whole process has demonstrated the need for independent media, the need for independent organization, and the need for all those who are seeking, let's be honest, not just to end the genocide that's taking place, but I would say to change the world, to find some avenue to connect with other people who want to see an end to all of these horrors. We can't do that by relying on institutions who are owned by interests that are completely opposed to what our interests are. I would say the difference between someone like myself and a BBC journalist who refuses to say the clear role of the IDF is that I'm honest about whose side that I'm on, right? I say I'm 100% on the side of the Palestinians, and I won't apologize for that.
Are you on the side of the Palestinians or on the side of truth and justice, as it were?
I think the two things are synonymous, essentially. Today, I think the Palestinian struggle is a struggle for all people. All of the oppressed all over the world, I think, can see themselves in that. I think Palestine is the most extreme example of how far those in power will go to justify their interests, to maintain their system, because this is a reflection also, I would say, of imperialism and how imperialism manifests itself, that the Western governments really upholds on the world stage. And so it is about truth. I'm quite optimistic, actually, about the future, because I think there's a whole generation of people coming through now who can see through these lies and they want to do something about it, through the media, yes, but also through on-the-ground organisation as well.
Fiona Lali, great to have you on the programme. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
The media's critical role in wartime is fraught with the consequences of biased reporting, perpetuating cycles of violence and misinformation and dehumanizing entire populations. The question remains, can the media fulfill its crucial role as a watchdog, or will it continue to be a tool for those in power? History suggests that the mainstream institutional media will continue to fail in its duty to hold the powerful accountable if it continues to favor its close relationship with the political establishment over those genuinely in need of justice and transparency. As we confront these pressing issues, the integrity of our information sources remains paramount. The accountability of the media is not just about past mistakes, but about ensuring a future where truth prevails over propaganda. It's a challenge that requires not just our vigilance, but the unwavering demand for honesty. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team, thanks for watching.